Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. What I want to do over the next half hour is have a conversation, and the conversation I want to have is this. I have been a journalist for almost 15 years. I started at the New York Times when I was 18 years old. And during that period, I know some people still think I look like I'm 18. During that period, something profound has changed beyond the internet. It's actually about everybody in this room and how we all behave in the context of news and in the context of journalism. And what I would put forth today is the supposition that everybody in this room has become their own reporter. And I want to talk a little bit about what the implications of that mean for the profession of journalism, for our democracy, and for how we all take in information. So, but I want everybody here for a second, a little thought experiment. Think back, if everybody here might remember when they first learned in 2009 that Tiger Woods had his little accident where his wife went after him with a golf club and he got into a little bit of a car accident down in Florida. Now, the reason that I raise this particular issue in 2009 is if you think back to how you took in that news, I will bet you did something like I did, which was I remember going to TMZ first to find out what all of the gossip was about what was happening and what really was happening. I wasn't really sure. So then I went over to ESPN.com and I got their version of what was happening. And then there was a link to one of the local newspapers in Florida, and I went over there to figure out what was going on with that version, which was actually probably pretty close to what was happening, much better than TMZ, but TMZ actually had some of the more fun, juicy stuff about what was going on with the wife and the divorce. And then I went over to Sports Illustrated. They had a more official version. They had some more details that I didn't know about. Then I went over to People magazine, of all things, to try to figure out, again, a little bit more of the gossip. And then finally, when I was done with all of that, I went to the New York Times. And I went to the New York Times because I considered the New York Times to be the baseline. I knew that it was the baseline which I could compare everything else against. And the reason I bring up this example is because in many ways, my experience, I imagine, is not very different than everybody else in this room, which is that we've all become reporters. I'll throw out another one for you real quick. Whitney Houston. Does everybody remember Whitney Houston died 2 years ago? If you go and look at the traffic patterns of what was happening when Whitney Houston died, most people went to first. They went to CNN. Then, for better or worse, good luck to Marissa Mayer, they went to Yahoo. Yahoo, everybody was checking out Yahoo because they had picked up a piece from Entertainment Tonight, which had picked up another piece from the E! Channel, and on and on and on and on. And so all of us are trying to figure all this out. What did everybody do this weekend when they first heard the news that Yahoo was in talks to buy Tumblr? Came on All Things D, to their credit. I wish I could have claimed the scoop. But I can tell you, if you just look around, people then went to say, well, is that really right? There's rumors of this happening. Maybe I should go check out TechCrunch. What's TechCrunch saying? Maybe I'm now going to, oh, you know what, I'm going to go over, I'm going to look at what Business Insider is saying. Now, Business Insider didn't have a report on what was happening except to report that Tumblr apparently had been very chatty and then all of a sudden wasn't chatty. That unto itself was a report. And so people took that information and they blogged that, and then it was over to maybe the New York Times and our Bits website to figure out what the Times was saying. And so what you're seeing is this new world where all of us are searching, and this raises profound issues, for a truth, but perhaps we're all searching for our own truth. And by the way, all of us are doing this. Maybe we're not even linking around to all these different sites the way I just described. You're just literally sitting there watching the Twitter feed. And you're popping in from place to place to place. And you're looking for these little morsels of information that would then all triangulating to create news. Last night on Twitter, a friend of mine tweeted out that they had seen Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, who's testifying, I believe, as we speak today in Washington, saw him over at the hearing room checking out the room. Now, that tweet went out. That ended up turning into a news story as 3 other people did similar things and then saw him walking down the street and which hotel he was staying at and whatnot. And so what you're seeing is this triangulation, and it's changing potentially the way the professionals in the world do business. Now, the good news is you're getting all this new information. The bad news is, think about the hack on the Associated Press's Twitter account 2 weeks ago. So all of a sudden, you know, you're getting news, and by the way, how did we all react to that, right? You saw the tweet if you were on the AP's Twitter's account. However, I bet you money, as everybody that I know did, all of a sudden we started looking for other tweets, and we saw, well, there's no other tweets. So do we believe this report or do we not believe this report? Let's go turn on CNN. Let's go to the New York Times website. Let's go to the Wall Street Journal, whomever. And so again, it becomes this sort of round robin of news. And so the good news is it becomes a very efficient market, right? All of a sudden, that piece of news was corrected virtually within minutes. That's the best part about what you could argue the internet has done for the news business. If a bad piece of information gets out there, it can actually be corrected quite quickly. But here's the flip side to that. The market, the stock market dropped 500 points in the course of about a minute and a half. Now, it corrected very quickly, but there was a lot of money to be lost and perhaps made during that same period. Now, one of the things when I think about this new world where we're all reporters and triangulating information, I invariably go back and think about the financial crisis. I wrote this book called Too Big to Fail about the details of the financial crisis and how it all happened. And the reason I think about the financial crisis is I do believe that if we had a crisis like this today, we'd have a much bigger problem with everybody playing reporter. Because when you think about what took place during 2008 and during the financial crisis, what you would note is that we had a run on the bank, which ultimately is a run on confidence. Why did we have a run on confidence? Because there were rumors, there were stories being written about people taking their money out of the banks, companies taking their money out of the banks. Now, at some of the bigger, more traditional news outlets, I don't want to say we sat on some of that news, but I would say there were considered decisions being made about whether to disseminate that news and when to disseminate that news, because the second you publish that news that so-and-so is taking money from Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns, all of a sudden what happens? Everybody who gets that news says to themselves, well, geez Louise, I don't think I should have my money at that bank either. I'm going to go do it. It becomes a mirror, and it amplifies the issue. Now, if we had the financial crisis tomorrow, if we could go in a time machine, nobody wants to have a sequel here, but if we did, the problem is, I would argue, as quickly and as efficient as the market may have become in terms of correcting information online, the ability for everybody in this room to tweet out and say, you know what, I just took my money from Bank of America, and I just took my money from JP Morgan, and what that means, and the responsibility that entail or don't entail. And so in a world where you're watching institutions every single day try to put out what I call brush fires, worried that they're going to turn into an inferno, you're thinking about a world where all those brush fires, that nobody can put those out, especially, by the way, when it's true. And so that's something that I think we all need to think about in terms of what the practical implications are and some of the larger issues. The other thing that I worry about as a reporter in this business more than ever is because everybody in this room has become a reporter, it's forcing other reporters, the quote-unquote professionals, to rush to judgment in a way they didn't before. Now, I like to think that I haven't done this, but there is clearly a newfound pressure to get that news out when, frankly, everybody in this room has the ability to get the same news out if they see something. And so you're seeing a tweet, you're seeing a story, a blog, what have you, and then the big institutions are saying to themselves, we don't have the story, what do we do? And where a story might have taken several hours, or if not days to report out, people are deciding, goodness gracious, we got to publish this story too because it is everywhere anyway. And so what does that mean? And what does that mean to our democracy? Now, the last sort of thought I'd like to leave you with, and then I'm hoping we can open up for questions and really try to turn this into a conversation, is the idea that one of the questions people say to me all the time is they say, you know, it feels like the news is so polarized, that we as a country have become polarized and that the news itself has become polarized. And I think that that's very, very true, that we all have become much more polarized. And in part, one of the reasons is that despite the fact that all of us have become reporters and all of us think that we're triangulating news from various different sources, if you look carefully and look at your bookmarked list, if you will, or the Twitter feed where you're getting your news from, I will bet you that a lot of that is coming from the same place or the same type of people. What we've done is we've created these communities, and we talk about community as a great thing. And in many ways it is, because it allows for us to have a conversation. It allows for us, hopefully, to have a thoughtful conversation with other thoughtful people and to have that dialogue. But what it doesn't do is expose us to the other side. So as a journalist who likes to think I'm objective, and I try, and sometimes I succeed, and I imagine those who read me sometimes think I fail, but the goal is to be able to tell the reader both sides of the story. Now, my worry is that in this new world where I'm talking about, where all of us think we're reporters, but we're all getting information effectively from some of the same sources, at least within our own circle, we're not seeing both sides of the story. We're not seeing you know, the left version of the story or the right version of the story, depending on which side of the aisle you come to all of this, depending on how you approach a news issue or not. And that poses a sort of larger problems for our democracy, for the way we consume news, and for the conversation writ large that we're having every single day. And that's something I worry about very, very much, and hope, if I leave you with any thought today, it's that we actually spend some more time looking and talking and thinking about the other side of the story. So before we open up to questions, here's my one pledge or request, if you will, of this audience, which is, I imagine there are people here who have never been to the Daily Caller. I'm making this up. I imagine there are people here on the other side of the aisle who have never been to the Huffington Post or don't like the Huffington Post. And what I'd ask you to do is spend some time with the other side, because my greatest worry is that we have created an entire system of people that are doing the opposite, and that we actually don't know the other side of the story. We don't realize the other side of the story. And I think when you think about what's happening in Washington, when you think about the conversations we're happening even around business, we're not necessarily looking at all of the issues. We're looking into our own world. So with that, my goal was to try to make everybody think, to raise hopefully some provocative questions. I may have succeeded, I may have failed. You'll tell me, but why don't we open it up, get some mics out if we could, and see where the conversation takes us.
Hi. In a society where information is disseminated by so many sources, what responsibility or role does a news organization have? Well,
so the question, for those of you who couldn't hear, I know it's a little louder. I don't know if everybody can hear. I have a mic here, so it's easier for me, or a speaker for me. The question was, what is the role? What is the role of the news organization? I would argue, when you think about the New York Times, or for example, my experience every morning on Squawk Box on CNBC, our role is to be the baseline, meaning you can spend all your time on TMZ or somebody's blog on Tumblr or what have you, but ultimately my hope is you come back to certain resources that you say are the trusted resource. This is the place where you can actually find out what's really going on. Having said that, I think we in the traditional media have to recognize that, you know, we just had BuzzFeed up here before, that there is a new world, and for better or worse, and I find myself, I don't know if I'm a victim of it, I want to read the gossip too. And I want to hear what people are saying, even if it's not true or credible. And that's actually something that I think has changed remarkably over the past couple of years that I've sort of watched, because I found myself not only doing it, but the audience doing it. And the audience, and maybe people here will disagree, I don't find that the audience looks at a particular news story that's wrong, hopefully not at the New York Times or an NBC property, but that's wrong, and doesn't ding the organization for it. Meaning, I used to believe that if there was a story that was wrong, that reader, that viewer, that whatever, was never coming back again. I thought you lost them forever. And in this world, I think we, for some reason, have decided we're willing to take in other pieces of information, whether they're right or wrong. I don't subscribe to that as a reporter. That's not my policy. But I do find it to be a profound shift, and I do worry that it will have sort of larger implications. have a question right there.
Hi. You know, I took a course in college on journalism, and a big theme was
My apologies.
was the ethics of journalism.
Right.
So, what are news organizations doing today to uphold those ethics in the light of all of this?
Well, I think that, I think it goes back to the same issue in terms of my previous answer, which is that traditional news organizations, and traditional sort of sounds fuddy-duddy and has become a pejorative in some sense, have tried to be the standard bearer for a lot of this news. And I think, generally speaking, we're doing a pretty good job. As I said, my worry is sort of a long-term creep, a long-term worry that in a day and age when people care about ratings and they care about page views and they care about comments and they care about the most emailed list and they care about all of these other barometers, that it becomes that much harder. And also becomes harder in a world where everybody here wants to find not just the truth, but your own truth. It's whatever you think the truth is. And that makes it harder on a news organization that might be willing or prepared or to tell you a truth that you don't want to believe is the truth. And that I think is sort of the fundamental issue. And it's an ethical issue, only that I think the goal is that everybody should be searching for the truth, but probably not in quotes. I think we have a question over here.
Yeah, so if news organizations, if your role is to be the baseline, but you're employing a paywall, not that I disagree with that model,
Right.
but how do you ensure that you stay relevant against all the stories that are constantly coming out for free, I guess?
It's a great question. The question was about the paywall and how do you stay relevant and how does that make sense? I would argue in this day and age, if we are supposed to be the baseline, if we are supposed to be the search for truth, one of the ways you get the truth, as opposed to some of these other things, is you need to finance the truth. You need to finance reporters and editors and producers and technicians and staffs. And I think that one of the things that's happened, for better or worse, there's something very additive to the democracy in that everybody now has an opportunity to speak. There's something else that makes it a little bit more challenging because there's a lot of noise out there. And what I would argue is, unfortunately, a lot of the noise is from lower, I don't want to say lower paid because that's probably unfair, but organizations where people are spouting their opinion as opposed to actually going to Afghanistan or going to, you name whatever far-flung place it is, Syria. Most bloggers are not doing that. Most people on Twitter are not, except for the locals. And by the way, that's also another interesting element because you have local people in different places who are able to then provide a view, and that also is shifting the landscape. But again, I think the paywall, A, is permeable at the New York Times, and B, you got to finance it somehow.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I grew up on newspaper.
God bless you.
And my parents grew up on newspaper.
God bless them.
And I'm always told those newspaper reporters, they have special search engines and special methods of getting at the truth that your average person doesn't have. And I still have that perception, that the New York Times has those resources. And I guess it's kind of expanding on what you were just talking about. How do you keep that? Do you have that competitive advantage, and how do you keep that going forward as a newspaper?
I think there's two issues there. I use the same Google search engine that you do. You're not. You look like you could be wearing Google glasses, but you're not. I wouldn't say there is a superpower, if you will, that somehow professional journalists have over other journalists. I think there's a very different distinction, which is that there's a heritage and a tradition at the paper and a skill set that's evolved over time by having teams of editors and teams of reporters and teams of producers and teams of copy editors and teams of proofreaders and what that all means to the process. We broke a story last week about Sony, Dan Loeb, the big activist investor going after Sony, trying to break up that company. That was not a story that was written in the course of an hour. That was a story that took 2.5 days, and there were lots of different issues that emerged and evolved over time. In that case, we were relying on reporters in New York, and by the way, relying on reporters in Tokyo. That's something that you can't necessarily get from a 3-person outfit and a dog. And so I do think that that's to me when you see the benefit. When you see Tom Friedman in Syria, that's the benefit. And I just don't think that you necessarily can get that from other places. Though, to their credit, there are a lot of places. I mean, let me tell you, I do read the Huffington Post. I do go to the Drudge Report every day. I go to the New York Post. So, I don't want to end to TMZ, as I've already said. So I'm there. But when I'm going back to try to figure out what I think is the truth or what I hope to sort of use as my baseline, I do come back to the established players like the Times. I think there's a question back there.
Hi, my name is Gavin OHara. So I wanted to get back to the idea of how polarized things have become, how divisive, and both the way it plays out in media and the way it plays out in Washington. It's hard to separate the two for me, being a culture watcher and a politics watcher. But in olden times, we blamed the mainstream media for all that, but now, we're curating our own news to a far greater extent. I'm making my own Twitter lists. I'm choosing who to follow, etc. Now, again, in olden times, I would watch things like the 700 Club, not because I believed in it, but because quite the opposite. I wanted to see what people saw in it.
Right.
I think I do less of that now with things like Twitter lists. I don't have a Twitter list of people who are polar opposites to me. Maybe I should. But to you, as we look forward and we look at all this massive information and the aggregation of information, how do we see a way forward that's less polarizing? Or do we really only see this notion of reinforcing our own beliefs?
My worry is it does get reinforcing, and sort of the suggestion I'm hoping to make here is that you get out of that curated mode. Or if you are going to curate, decide that you're going to curate the other side. If you're going to read the editorial page of the New York Times, which I suggest, read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Read the editorial page of the Financial Times. Read the editorial pages of Huffington Post, and then go to the Daily Caller, and then go to the Blaze. I mean, check it out, because I do think that there's a huge benefit towards seeing the other side. By the way, depending on what your side is, knowing the other side will make, potentially, will to the extent that you think you're right, it'll make your ability to argue your point even stronger. I was on Bill Maher on Friday night, and there was a conversation about gun control. I am for gun control. There's others that are not. I sat next to a very talented and thoughtful columnist and commentator named S.E. Cupp, a conservative who owns guns, likes guns, thinks there's no problem with guns, wants everybody to have a gun. I would tell you that she had a great argument. She had her facts and she marshaled them, and I wished after that panel discussion that I had spent more time studying her view and version of the world, because I think I would have been able to marshal my own facts better to argue against it. I think we have time for a couple more. Yes.
I was just wondering you said we're all reporters nowadays, and yet every time you mentioned sources of news, they were organizations. I mean, TMZ and TechCrunch and even Drudge Report and things like that. And plus, even with like the AP hack, for example, you said, well, everyone saw the tweet. Well, first of all, I don't follow AP, and I never saw it. And frankly, if they'd hacked me and put it out there, no one would have seen it at all. Right. So I'm just wondering, is it just, not social media boosterism or hype, but is it, we're not quite there yet as everyone's a reporter. Organizations still matter, and more like stringers or even like channels or something like that. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I think that organizations still do matter, and I have highlighted a number of different organizations. But I do think, and I wish I had, again, something on the tip of my tongue for you, but I do think there have been examples. I'll give you one, actually. A year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, Microsoft bought Skype. Maybe this is 2 or 2.5 years ago now. Okay. How did that story first emerge? If I remember correctly, and please don't hold me to this, I know I'm being filmed, so do not keep this videotape. If I remember correctly, there was a tweet by somebody who was the roommate of a lawyer at I don't know if it was Sullivan and Cromwell or Simpson and Thatcher based in San Francisco, who suggested that their roommate wasn't around because they were working on a big deal over the weekend. And I think that it was that ultimately led the bigger organizations like myself to then go figure out what was happening. Now, that's just a little example, and I may be off on the details of whether they speculated it was Microsoft or whether they just said that the roommate was working. I don't remember. There was something about a roommate. So I do think that, and by the way, I believe that person didn't have a lot of followers. And so, but invariably, if you have 5, 10, 15, 20 followers, and one of those people happens to have 100 followers, and they happen to retweet it, all of a sudden you can see how the dynamic spreads. I posted a tweet the other day that nobody retweeted, and then I posted a tweet literally 5 minutes later. I do have a lot of followers, and it looked like something order of 50,000 people retweeted it. So, you know, yes, we do have a megaphone, but I do think that everybody in their own way has that same, maybe not the megaphone to the same degree, but sooner or later, whether you have the followers or not, it becomes that megaphone. Why don't we take one or two more questions? Yes, ma'am.
So we talked a little bit, or you spoke a little bit about everyone being journalists, but that there's credibility and baseline.
You got to hope.
But you got to hope. But I think back to what Walter Cronkite spoke about, where he saw this shift where facts were less important and speed was more important. So how, as we evolve and how younger people are getting their news, how do we ensure that people really are getting facts and do still have trusted baselines?
Well, I think what you're going to see, and I could be wrong, but I think what you're going to see over time is you're going to see lots of either news organizations or individuals who are using Twitter or Tumblr or whatever platform you're thinking about, either at a big organization or a smaller organization, and sometimes they'll be right and sometimes they'll be wrong. And I think then as a reader you'll say, you know what, I want to know that because maybe there's a kernel of truth in there, but I'm still got to find the trusted place. And so I think there's still an opportunity for that trusted place. I think that, in fact, I would argue, and I am on the payroll, but I would argue there's even more of an argument for that trusted place than ever before, given all of that. But I do think people will try to find the news first. They will always try to do that. They will try to dig out that little morsel, and then hopefully they'll try to figure out if it's true or not. And I think that's going to be the biggest distinction for all of us. I think we have one more minute before they force me off the stage. So.
Hi. So you were talking about, you know, the speed increasing of this news and how now everyone can be a reporter. And the best analog I saw in finance is when decades ago they switched from people trading stocks on the back of bicycles to using the electronic system that we use today.
Right.
And the biggest result I saw from that is that, you know, sort of the same thing. Anyone could trade stocks, then I can go on my computer and trade. And the result of that was not really that the market got less efficient. It was that the best people became more efficient and built financial models. Financial engineering came about. Is that sort of the way you see news distribution going? That instead of the quality lowering because anyone can report, really just the cream will rise and...
A little bit. Let me take two pieces of that. I'm actually going to take the finance side first. I agree with you that the democratization, if you will, of the markets has created its own set of problems, subset of issues, both the financial crisis unto itself at some level and just a number of other issues that relate to it. And the idea that the cream has risen in certain people, you talk about the inequality issue, that is a real one. Having said that, I would argue the opposite point as well, which is the democratization of the market allowed, frankly, less our generation, but if you go back and look at my parents' generation, people who invested in stocks or began to invest in stocks in the 70s and 80s, allowed an entire sort of new generation of wealth that didn't exist before, and I'm not sure would have existed without the democratization of the market. So it's a double-edged sword. On the news, I think it's the same story. I think overall, it may ultimately be a good thing because it's going to create more voices in this larger democracy. But democracy sometimes has problems. It doesn't all work out all the time. Hopefully over the long run it works out, but there are going to be times where we're going to say it's not so great. And I think that's probably part of the issues related to the news. My time is up. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate the questions, the conversation. Thanks.